She was just a stable maid, but she stole the heart of a prince about to marry. The morning light filtered through a haze of grey as mist clung to the cobblestones in the lower courtyard of Castle Grunwald. It was not yet 6, but Annalisa Bauer had been awake for hours. The heavy scent of horses, damp straw, and old leather filled her lungs as she moved between stalls, pitchfork in hand, the worn handle pressing against the soft skin of her palm. She worked in silence as always, her brown linen skirts dusted with hay, her braided hair tucked beneath a simple cap. She swept, hauled, and fed without complaint. No one asked her opinion. No one asked her name. She had been in the royal stables since she was 8 years old, first as a child handed a bucket and a brush, then as a girl who knew every horse's mood before a single hoof struck the floor. Now 19, Lisa had long since accepted her place, invisible, useful, and safe, so long as she remained so. She knew which grooms could be trusted, which gates stuck when the weather turned, and which nobility never acknowledged her presence. The world above the stables, marble halls, silk gowns, and silver spoon conversation, was not hers to enter. She saw it only from the shadows, through the barred windows of the mews, or when polishing saddles in the cold. It was better that way. That morning, preparations buzzed through the yard with unusual urgency. An equestrian exhibition had been arranged for visiting nobility, a display of the crown's breeding stock and the prince's riding skill. The horses had been brushed to a glossy sheen, their manes plaited, their coats combed until they glowed like polished wood. Lisa had been told to remain behind the stables, but at the last moment, one of the grooms fell ill, and she was summoned to help bring the final horses forward. Her hands were already damp from washing bridles, her apron streaked with damp straw. She smoothed her sleeves as best she could and followed the command, leading a chestnut mare toward the outer arena with careful steps. The world beyond the stable gates opened before her, broad viewing stands, gilded canopies, silken parasols fluttering like butterflies above the noblewomen gathered to watch. She kept her eyes down. The arena's pale sand stretched wide and flat, ringed by fresh garlands. Men in frock coats stood at intervals, holding ledgers or offering murmured remarks to one another. Prince August, mounted astride a stallion of near-black coloring, rode at a slow canter along the far edge. He was dressed in formal riding attire, dark blue coat, silver trim at the cuffs, white gloves grasping the reins with easy strength. Even from a distance he looked the part of nobility, elegant, untouchable, and burdened by command. Lisa paused just outside the ring, waiting for the mare to be collected by a groom. She knew better than to linger. But the prince's stallion slowed. His gaze swept the perimeter of the arena, and then paused. She felt it before she saw it, a flicker, a second too long. Prince August's eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. It was not a smile, not a frown, just a glance that landed and lingered. Perhaps it meant nothing. Perhaps it was simple curiosity, the passing interest of a man momentarily distracted by the sight of a girl holding a lead rope in muddy boots. But someone noticed. From the velvet canopy beside the prince's mother, Baroness Ilse von Brecht narrowed her eyes. Tall, sharply dressed and raven-haired, the Baroness had made a name for herself within the court through calculated whispers and alliances. She was known for finding opportunity in silence and wielding it. Her voice rang out, too loud to be casual. What bold little stable thing dares to hold His Highness's attention so greedily? Surely she's been given no leave to look. The laughter that followed was delicate, false, the kind that cuts cleanest when delivered with a smile. The court turned, faces turned. Lisa stood frozen, the mare shifting beside her, confused by the sudden hush. No one corrected the Baroness. No one defended the girl in the dirt-stained apron. A steward stepped forward, expression carefully neutral. You are dismissed from stable service, girl. Report to the palace gardens by sunrise tomorrow. New orders. Lisa said nothing. She bowed her head, handed off the mare's lead, and walked back through the sand, each step stiff with shame. She didn't look up again. The silence followed her. By the time the exhibition concluded, her name had been whispered through every corridor. Servants would not repeat the accusation, but they would remember it. Nobles wouldn't recall her name, but they would remember her face, and the fact that she had presumed to meet a prince's eyes. The afternoon passed with sickening slowness. She returned to the loft above the stables, where her few belongings were kept in a wooden chest: a second apron, a pair of worn stockings, a comb. Her body ached from the tension of the day, her jaw sore from keeping it clenched. There was no one to tell, no one who would listen. In the stables, she was already being avoided. A shadow suddenly carrying too much weight. The sky darkened early. Rain began to fall just after dusk, cold and unrelenting. She had not eaten, but the idea of food turned her stomach. Instead, she packed her chest slowly, folding garments with stiff fingers. The loft walls groaned as the wind picked up. Drops of rain slipped through the eaves, landing on the wooden floor beside her boots. Thunder rolled low in the distance, and then a sound. Footsteps on the stair below. She stilled, one hand still on a folded linen shift. The steps were slow, deliberate, too heavy for one of the younger stable boys, too light for Master Cole, the head groom. She rose from the floor, brushing her palms down the sides of her skirt. Her heart beat hard against her ribs, not from fear, but something more unnerving. The door creaked. She turned. Prince August stood framed in the doorway, his shoulders filling the space. No attendants, no guards. Just him, dressed in a dark coat that was damp at the collar, hair pushed back from his brow by the wind. His eyes met hers again, not from across a courtyard, but here, 10 feet away, in the pale flicker of a lantern hung from a nail in the beam. He said nothing, nor did she. Rain tapped steadily against the roof above them as the prince remained still, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the doorframe, his expression unreadable. And Lisa, frozen beside her open chest, realized she had no idea what he was going to say. The morning air was damp and cool, the kind that clung to fabric and made stone steps slick beneath hurried boots. Lisa stood at the edge of the palace gardens just after sunrise, the folds of her brown wool skirt still heavy from yesterday's rain. Her hands were wrapped around the handle of a battered metal watering can, its base dented from years of use, its contents already warming in the light. She waited in silence while the head gardener gave orders to the apprentices, his voice clipped and precise. When he finally turned to her, his eyes did not hold contempt, only expectation. "West Terrace," he said. "You'll tend the espaliered fruit, and watch your footing on the gravel. The Countess nearly slipped yesterday and blamed the roses." Lisa nodded. She did not speak. She had learned quickly that silence offered a kind of armor. The garden was vast, an ordered sprawl of green geometry, bordered by stone balustrades and trimmed with obsessive precision. Gravel paths formed narrow veins between blooming beds of foxglove, delphinium, and nodding peonies. Farther back, the formal rows gave way to the herb terraces, the espaliered pear and apple trees trained against sun-warmed brick, and the great glasshouse that stood like a cathedral of light. She made her way along the path, careful not to meet the eyes of anyone who passed. A noblewoman in a saffron-colored pelisse walked nearby, trailing 2 perfumed pugs and murmuring gossip to another lady. Lisa kept her gaze fixed on the rose hedge, but she felt it, the pause, the glance over a fan, the faint tightening of voices when she passed. The rumors had followed her like a trailing vine, the stable-maid who dared to look at a prince, the servant who drew the attention of a royal, the girl who must have done something, to make Baroness Ilse speak her name aloud in a crowd. No one repeated the words to her face, but they didn't have to. The glances were enough, the way apprentices stopped speaking when she entered a tool shed, the way the stewardess handed her assignments with a hand too brisk, too clean, as if contact might stain her. She did not weep, not in front of anyone, but there were moments, brief, unguarded seconds between tasks when the ache in her chest swelled until it pressed against her throat. She buried it beneath dirt-caked gloves and the scent of crushed mint. Still, there was peace to be found. She discovered it in the rhythm of pruning, the whisper of leaves brushing against her sleeves, the delicate patience required to coax a vine back into alignment. The fruit trees, older than half the noble families in the castle, responded to her touch without judgment. The roses bloomed for no one but the sun, and the herbs, particularly the rosemary and valerian, were resilient in ways she understood. By the third morning, she had stopped listening for whispers. By the fifth, she had begun to forget the sound of laughter in the arena. The storm arrived in the middle of her midday duties. The sky dimmed without warning, the air thickening as if the earth were holding its breath. A clap of thunder cracked the sky open, and fat raindrops began to fall, soaking the stone and turning gravel to mud in moments. The head gardener called for everyone to take cover. Apprentices scattered toward the colonnades. Lisa didn't run. She couldn't. Her skirts were heavy with water by the time she reached the nearest refuge, the glass conservatory. The door groaned open under her hand, and she stepped inside, breath catching from the shift in warmth. The scent hit her first: damp earth, hot iron, and the green perfume of hothouse leaves. Inside, the storm was a muffled drum roll on the roof, the rain racing down the panes like rivers on glass. A fine mist clung to the air. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the bench near the entrance. A small potted lavender had been left exposed on the ledge, its gray-green leaves quivering. She reached for it, cradling the ceramic base with both palms, and carried it gently toward the central table, away from the leaking window. The door creaked again. She turned, too quickly, and nearly dropped the pot. Prince August stepped inside, shaking rain from his shoulders. His coat was dark with moisture at the seams, his cravat slightly loosened, as though he had come from the stables or from some hurried errand. His hair, damp at the edges, clung to his temples. She froze, breath suspended. He saw her immediately. His gaze lowered to the plant in her hands, then lifted again to her face. He did not move forward, nor did he retreat. They stood in a small oasis of warmth and scent, surrounded by palms and fig leaves and the press of summer humidity. For a moment, the world was thunder and glass and nothing else. She dipped her head, the familiar gesture of deference automatic. "Your Highness," she said softly. Not as an invitation, simply a necessity. "You've been reassigned," he said, voice quiet. Not surprised, merely acknowledging the change. "Yes, sir." The silence stretched, filled only by the storm above and the creak of vines shifting in their frames. He stepped further in, carefully removing his gloves and placing them beside a watering can. "The gardens are not so different from the stables," he said. Lisa's hands tightened on the pot, her knuckles whitening. "No, Your Highness. But they're more exposed." She hesitated, then answered, "Yes, sir." His gaze lingered on her posture, on the way she angled her shoulders slightly away, the way her eyes stayed fixed on the lavender's roots. She was used to being seen without being noticed. This, whatever this was different. She should have left. Protocol required it, but the storm had thickened, the windows shivering with each new gust. Leaving now would be not just improper, but foolish. So she stood still, her presence unacknowledged by design, yet impossible to ignore. "You cared for my mare," he said suddenly. She blinked, her voice nearly catching. "Yes, Your Highness." She was always calm before the hunt. Most horses are not. She prefers a certain brush. She doesn't like her flank touched without warning. His lips curved faintly. Not a smile, just the faintest shift of expression. "I thought it was my riding that calmed her." "You ride well," she said. Then, after a beat too long, "But she prefers the brush." Another pause. A shared silence that carried something unsaid. She dared a glance upward, just once, His eyes were gray-blue, the kind that could be distant or intimate depending on the slant of light. Just now, they looked neither. Only curious. Only still. She looked down again. "I should return to my duties," she said, voice low. "The rain hasn't stopped." "No, sir." Neither of them moved. Outside, thunder cracked again, closer this time. Inside, a fig leaf trembled. She returned the lavender pot to the table and turned to the bench, reaching for the damp rag she'd left behind. She could feel his eyes on her, not with scrutiny, but with something quieter. She didn't know what it was, and she didn't want to guess. When she finally stepped toward the door, he did not stop her. She opened it into a sheet of rain and disappeared into the downpour. By the time the sun set, the castle walls steamed gently in the warmth that followed the storm. Liesa climbed the servants' stairs to the uppermost level, her shoes squelching softly on the stone. Her new quarters were small, a narrow room beneath the eaves of the servants' wing, with a single bed, a basin, and a chest no wider than a man's shoulders. She peeled off her wet clothing and hung them near the window's cracked pane, the fabric heavy with scent and memory. The hallway outside was quiet. Candlelight flickered behind closed doors. She reached for the key to her room, then stopped. A single envelope lay beneath the door. No seal, no crest, only a single initial, A. The ink was dark, the script elegant, the paper smooth beneath her fingers. Inside, one sheet. The message was brief. You are not merely a servant, and one day you must decide who you truly are. The weather turned mild again, and with it came a restless golden warmth that spread across the castle grounds like a lullaby. Liesa worked through the softness of morning light. Her sleeves rolled to her elbows as she tied back the overgrowth near the low stone wall. The gardens were in their richest bloom, lavender buzzing with bees, white roses heavy with scent, and the espaliered trees swelling with early fruit. Her hands, always dirt-stained and steady, moved with quiet precision. She had learned how to tend without being seen. But that became harder with each passing day. She noticed it first on the third morning after the storm. Prince August's route through the grounds had changed. Before, he had walked the upper path behind the terraces, occasionally passing the gardeners with a polite nod but never lingering. Now he passed her section, deliberately, unhurriedly, pausing near the quince trees or the low marble bench just beyond the mint beds. He never stopped to address her directly in front of others, but he began to ask small things, questions no one else would have thought to ask. How do you coax rosemary to flower so early? Why do the violets fare better in that shaded spot? And once, softly, do you ever wish you worked somewhere else? His voice was always measured, respectful. Their conversations remained brief and clothed in formal courtesy. But beneath the words was something slower, more deliberate. He listened. He waited for her answers as if they carried weight, even when she barely raised her voice above the breeze. He spoke of the court in clipped tones, of diplomatic visits and endless protocol, of women chosen for him by others, and how stifling it was to have no say in his own future. She never offered sympathy. She only listened. Liesa never asked why he came. But the nearness began to burn into her awareness. The scent of leather and starch from his coat, the slight tightening of his jaw when others passed nearby, the way he stood just far enough away to respect convention, but near enough for her to hear the quiet shift of breath when he exhaled. The palace staff noticed. Of course they did. A court could survive without loyalty, without truth, but never without rumor. Baroness Ilse von Brecht noticed most of all. The Baroness had resumed her daily strolls through the gardens, though she took little interest in the plants themselves. Her sharp eyes lingered too long when August paused by the herb wall. She stopped near Liesa's flower beds, under the guise of inspecting the roses, her remarks barbed with sweetness. Such industrious little hands, she mused aloud one afternoon, trailing a gloved finger along the rim of a terracotta pot. It must be difficult to find time for solitude, with so many distractions. Lisa murmured something inaudible and turned back to her task. Her hands shook slightly, but she didn't let it show. She thought of the first note every day, the slanted ink, the closing line. "You are not merely a servant." It returned to her again when the second letter appeared. She found it tucked inside her apron pocket at the end of her midday break, the envelope nearly identical to the first. No seal, no name, only the letter, A. She unfolded it beneath the olive tree behind the greenhouse. The script was the same, tight and formal, written in a style no longer taught to those below nobility. "They remember where you came from. Not everyone has forgotten. Be cautious. The court is not as blind as it pretends to be." There was no signature. She folded the note with trembling fingers, slipping it into the pocket of her skirt. It had been years, so many years, since she'd allowed herself to recall the truth. She had been a child when the whispers began, a name that vanished, a family broken, a nobleman disgraced. Her protectors within the palace had made a careful arrangement. She would be kept close, raised without recognition, and given a life of labor rather than scandal. She had accepted it without resistance. A humble life was a safe one. Silence had been her armor. Until now. Now the truth pressed against her chest like a blade. She could not speak it, not aloud, and certainly not to him. Yet August continued to appear, and their brief exchanges carried more weight with each day. One morning he asked her what she missed most about being a child. "Wild strawberries," she replied, barely above a whisper. "We used to find them near the riverbank before the frost." His smile was quick, a flicker. "And did you always speak so softly then?" "I didn't speak at all." Something passed between them then, unsaid but felt. And though they never touched, never lingered long enough to draw open rebuke, the space between them narrowed in ways no one could name. It was a late afternoon when the silence broke. The sun had turned the garden paths gold. Liesa was kneeling by the rose beds, her apron streaked with green from fresh cuttings. She looked up when she heard her name, sharply, formally, from across the terrace. The head steward stood stiffly at the edge of the path. His expression was unreadable. "Come with me," he said. "Now." She wiped her hands on her apron and rose slowly, heart knocking against her ribs. Inside the palace, the air shifted. Cooler. More rigid. Her shoes echoed on the polished floor as she followed him to a long chamber adjacent to the great hall. The ceiling arched with carved wood. Members of the Dowager's court lined the room in quiet formation, fans fluttering, expressions carefully measured. At the center of the room stood the Dowager's steward, a man known for his precision. A jeweled comb was held in his gloved hands, a delicate piece of ivory and lapis, unmistakably noble. A quiet hush settled over the room. "This was taken from the dressing room of Countess von Ludenberg," the steward said without preamble. "An anonymous tip named you." Lisa's body chilled, her limbs still as stone. "I haven't." Her voice faltered, rough with disbelief. "I've never been in her chamber." "There is no record of you being assigned there," he replied. "And yet your name was offered." The court watched in silence. The Dowager's voice cut across the room like glass. "Servants who forget their place are often tempted by what isn't theirs." Lisa didn't answer. The accusation hovered, unsupported yet undeniably convenient. She had no advocate, no defense. Only the quiet pounding of her heart and the certainty that she was being removed. Expulsion was inevitable. The steward turned to a member of the council. "If there are no objections, I object." The voice rang clear. Heads turned. Prince August stood at the far end of the chamber, his coat still dusted with garden pollen, gloves in one hand. He stepped forward with deliberate calm, his expression unflinching. "This accusation is unfounded," he said, addressing the room. "The servant in question is not a thief." Gasps fluttered through the onlookers. The dowager's lips thinned. August continued. She has not entered the noble wing in days. Her time is accounted for. I request a formal inquiry before any action is taken. The silence grew heavy. Baroness Ilse, standing near the tapestry, spoke in a voice of polite dismay. Your Highness, surely you understand the damage such claims can bring to order. I understand perfectly, he replied without looking at her. Which is why I will not see justice determined by whispers. He turned his gaze to Lisa then. She stood very still, her breath shallow. Speak, he said, his voice lower now. Tell them. The room held its breath. Lisa's eyes flicked upward, meeting his for the first time in days. And softly, with barely more than a breath, she said, Because I am not who you think I am. The silence that followed Lisa's confession was so absolute that even the creak of the ancient beams overhead seemed to hush. A room that had moments before been laced with tension now held something far sharper, anticipation. Eyes turned toward her, not with idle curiosity, but with focused, breathless disbelief. She stood still at the center of the chamber, the hem of her dress damp and clinging to her ankles, her hands knotted tightly at her sides. Though her voice had been soft, its weight lingered in the air like a dropped stone sinking in still water. The steward, caught mid-motion, hesitated before slowly lowering the jeweled comb onto the velvet-lined tray. I was born to Baron Otto Falkenberg, Lisa said, her voice firmer now, low and steady. Before his exile. A few murmurs rippled through the court. The name carried weight, even buried in disgrace. Some of those present were old enough to remember the scandal, the political alliance that collapsed, the accusations of treason, the estate dissolved in shame, and the child, never accounted for, erased from the records. My mother was his second wife, she continued, a merchant's daughter, not of noble blood. She died of fever when I was 6. After the Baron's disgrace, his household was scattered. But one of his old retainers brought me here, not to be raised as a guest, but to be hidden. I was given work, a place among the servants, a chance to live, quietly. She met no one's gaze, keeping her eyes trained on the stones beneath her feet. Her breath came faster now, though her voice remained clear. I never intended to challenge the order of things. I was told that if I kept to myself, if I worked hard, I could stay. I never sought favor. I never expected notice. And until recently, I was content with that. More whispers, sharper now. A few among the court looked uncomfortable, their mouths set in lines of disdain or uncertainty. One elderly gentleman murmured a prayer beneath his breath, but others, the younger ones especially, watched Lisa with an expression that hovered somewhere between sympathy and awe. The dowager princess, seated at the center of the long bench, lifted her fan and snapped it closed with a sound like a whip crack. So we are meant to pity you, she said coldly. A child born of shame and raised in secrecy. You bring scandal with every breath, and yet you ask us to consider your honesty now? I ask nothing, Lisa replied, her voice trembling now, though she fought to hold her composure. Only that you know the truth before casting judgment. August stepped forward. He had not spoken since her first words, but now his presence filled the space between them like a wall, calm, unmoving, impossible to ignore. I have known this servant, he said, his voice projecting easily through the room. I have seen her work without recognition day after day for years. She has asked for nothing, sought nothing, and yet in silence she has shown more loyalty, more humility, and more strength than many of those born into rank. The dowager opened her mouth to speak, but August held up a hand, slowly, deliberately. For a heartbeat, even she obeyed the pause. I will not marry the Princess of Saxony, he continued. I make this known now, before the court and before the council. My loyalty belongs to Altburg, but my choice is mine. A stir went through the room, shock, confusion, the start of an objection. August pressed forward. If you insist on nobility of blood, he said, gesturing slightly toward Lisa, then here it stands, quiet and unacknowledged. If you demand propriety, you may find none more careful. If you want a woman capable of decorum, devotion, and grace, she is already among you. Not draped in silk or crowned in jewels, but she is here. She has been here all along. His voice broke, just slightly, in that last line, and the truth behind it made the room reel. Baroness Ilsa's spine went rigid. "This is madness," she said, her voice sharp. "You would throw away a diplomatic alliance. For what? A stable maid who knows how to blush and bow?" August turned to her. "I would rather risk scandal than live with dishonor." A beat of stillness. Then another. No one moved. No one dared speak. The dowager's voice sliced through the stillness. Silence. It came at once, brittle and absolute. But even she could see the shift. The court's attention had turned, not away from tradition entirely, but toward something else. Toward the possibility that this girl's presence meant something more than gossip. That dignity was not always marked by lineage. That perhaps restraint, humility, and honesty carried a nobility all their own. The steward cleared his throat. "Shall we dismiss the matter of the theft, then?" August did not look away from Lisa. "You will." Outside the chamber, the hall smelled of beeswax and stone. Lisa's steps echoed lightly as she walked, her hands folded in front of her skirt, her eyes fixed ahead. Each breath came harder than the last. Her chest was tight, not from fear, at least not only from fear, but from the impossible weight of what had just passed. She moved as if caught in a dream, the outlines of the palace blurring around her. She turned a corner and stepped beneath the western archway, just at the edge of the garden courtyard. The roses had begun to fade, their petals drooping in the late summer warmth. The breeze lifted the hem of her dress and brought the faintest scent of rain from the horizon. She stood there, rooted in place, until she heard footsteps behind her. August's. She turned as he approached, his pace unhurried, his face unreadable. He said nothing at first, and neither did she. The silence between them stretched, thick, intimate, and filled with everything that had not been said aloud in the council chamber. Her hands trembled at her sides. "What you said," she began, then stopped. "You've placed yourself in their crosshairs. They needed to hear the truth, even if it costs you everything." His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't answer. She looked down, her fingers curling into her palms. "You don't understand what they'll do to you," she whispered. "What they'll say." He stepped closer, his voice soft. "I know exactly what they'll say." She looked up then, her eyes bright with something between sorrow and resolve. "Then I must leave," she said, "before they take you from me." The wind carried the scent of straw and late summer soil across the stable yard as Lisa stepped from the shadow of the loft. Her boots struck the packed earth with muted urgency. She wore her simplest dress, the faded brown one with the hem repaired more times than she could count, and carried nothing but a worn cloth bundle clutched tightly in her hands. Her hair was unbound beneath her bonnet, still damp from washing, and her face was pale but determined. She had meant to leave without being seen, before anyone could stop her, before he could speak reason and turn her resolve into a wishful dream. If she disappeared now, quietly as she had lived, she might save him from the consequences still gathering like thunder above the court. The dowager princess would recover her dignity, and Baroness Ilsa would have no target left to torment. Let the court have its order. Let them believe she had vanished in shame. Let them forget her, if forgetting kept him safe. But as she crossed the edge of the yard, the sound of hooves broke her thoughts. She turned too quickly. August dismounted before the stable boy could reach for the reins. His boots struck the ground in a single motion, his cloak lifting with the wind and settling around his shoulders like a command. His hair was windblown, his jaw tight, and the moment his eyes locked with hers, she froze. "Where were you going?" His voice was low but sharp. She said nothing. Her hands tightened around the bundle in her arms. "You cannot leave." "I have to." Her voice cracked. "You saw what they did. What they said. It won't stop. I am not meant for this." He stepped closer, closing the distance in 3 strides. "You're not meant for this?" he repeated. "Or have they just made you believe that?" "August," she whispered, aching. "You don't understand?" "No," he said, quieter now, but firmer. "You don't understand. I've already chosen. You think you're protecting me by disappearing? You're not." His expression shifted, and something urgent surfaced beneath the calm. The weight of time, the burden of decisions he could no longer defer. "I won't let you walk away," he said. "Not again." And without waiting for her answer, he reached for her hand and led her across the stable yard, down the servants' path toward the private corridor behind the chapel. The guards at the entrance said nothing as he passed. The stone archways swallowed the sound of their footsteps, and Lisa, stunned into silence, let herself be pulled forward through the palace halls. The dowager princess sat alone in the antechamber near the south wing. Her ladies were absent, dismissed earlier for the evening. A single oil lamp flickered beside her on the carved table, its flame casting shadows on the long stretch of brocade covering her lap. She looked up slowly when they entered, her eyes sharp, her hands motionless. "I presume there is a reason for this interruption," she said. August bowed his head once. His grip on Lisa's hand did not loosen. "There is," he said. "A constitutional one." The dowager's brows lifted. "Is that so?" "I invoke the Royal Charter, Section 12, Line 4, he said. "It grants the heir the right to select a consort of noble descent, regardless of legitimacy, if the decision is approved by private counsel and deemed to be in the interest of the crown." The silence in the room thickened. The dowager's voice was a blade wrapped in silk. "That clause has not been cited in 3 generations. It exists to preserve bloodlines in times of war, not scandal." "Altburg's lineage is intact," August replied, "but its integrity is not. I will not marry a foreign princess I do not love, nor one who has no interest in this land or its people. You told me once that duty and affection rarely travel together. Perhaps it's time to prove they can." Lisa stood unmoving beside him, her pulse loud in her ears. The dowager's eyes turned to her then, calculated, assessing. No emotion flickered across the older woman's face, but the shift was visible. Not surprise, recognition. "I suppose I should not be astonished," the dowager murmured. "I knew your mother. She wore the same expression when cornered." The comment struck deeper than Lisa expected. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. A long pause followed. Then the dowager gave a slow nod, controlled and precise. "Very well," she said. "If you intend to use the charter, the council must be called." And so it was. Within hours, the private council gathered. 5 senior advisors, bound by discretion and years of precedence. Liesa was not allowed inside. She waited in a small chamber off the antechamber, her hands clasped tightly on her lap, unable to sit, unable to pace. A single window overlooked the courtyard where the roses grew. The sky outside was pale, uncertain, and fading into a lavender dusk. She didn't know how long the council deliberated. The voices on the other side of the wall rose and fell, muffled but stern. Her name was spoken more times than she could count. She had never expected it to matter again. When the door opened, it was August who stepped through. His expression didn't give anything away until he reached her, took her hands in his and said, "It's done." The council's approval, though not unanimous, was final. The argument that sealed it was simple. The girl in question bore noble blood, however unofficially acknowledged. She had carried herself with restraint and dignity despite provocation. There was no scandal that could be substantiated. And the prince had not wavered once in his declaration. That, above all, had moved the deciding vote. The dowager offered no public praise, but she did not object again. Her silence became the permission the court required to shift its tone. The whispers turned. Where once there had been outrage, now there was intrigue. Where there had been judgment, now there was admiration in disguise. Baroness Ilsa, whose schemes had unraveled in full view of the nobility, was quietly sent to oversee an estate in the southern provinces, for her health. Her absence was noted but not mourned. No one challenged the decision. The court adjusted. It always did. Weeks passed. Autumn melted into early winter, and the frost that crept along the windows brought with it a hush that softened everything. Lisa walked the gardens now not in servant's shoes, but in soft leather ones that carried her easily down familiar paths. Her dress, while modest, was trimmed in velvet. The apron was gone. The gloves on her hands were stitched with tiny pearls, gifts from ladies who once would not speak her name. She did not pretend to belong. But she did not shrink from the role that had found her either. The wedding was held quietly in the palace chapel. Only those the prince trusted were invited. No foreign dignitaries, no extended relations summoned out of obligation. Just those who had stood beside them without ambition. The vows were spoken in the local tongue. The ceremony lasted no more than 20 minutes. When they exited the chapel, snow had begun to fall, soft and slow. Later that day, August led her into the rebuilt glass house, the one that had collapsed under the weight of last summer's storm. The doors opened onto a room filled with winter roses, white and blush pink, bred to bloom even in cold. Their scent mingled with warm air and the faintest trace of wood smoke from the small cast-iron stove in the corner. Lisa stood in the center, his hand in hers. "I thought I was alone here," she said, her voice low. "You never were," he replied, lifting her hand to his lips. She looked at him, and the doubt that had weighed on her shoulders for years, slowly, carefully, began to lift. Outside, snow blanketed the ground. Inside, their fingers intertwined. Their breaths matched. And for the first time, there was nothing between them but peace. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the story? Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like to show your support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotions and life lessons. And before we say goodbye, we'd like to remind you that on the end screen, you'll see a recommendation for another exciting and charming story. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.